Hello, welcome to today's Oxplore online event. My name is Maya and I'm a student studying here at Oxford. I study Spanish and linguistics at St Anne's. And I also have a YouTube channel where I discuss my experience here at Oxford. So today we're going to be discussing languages, and you can enter the prize draw and the details of that will scroll across the bottom of your screen. You can enter via the chat window and via Instagram and Twitter as well. And you can also email until 11 AM tomorrow. It would be great if you could send us your best questions on would it be better if we all spoke the same language. Some will answer today and some all are eligible for the draw. And make sure you send us your school as well. So today's question is, would it be better if we all spoke the same language? Watching this animation shows us that it's not a very simple question to answer. So today we've got some experts from the University of Oxford. Could you all introduce yourselves, please?
So I'm Katherine Cole. I'm a professor of German, and I am currently running a research program called Creative Multilingualism, which includes a huge number of languages. So I've spent much of my life just moving between English and German because I grew up in Germany but with an English mum, and I've done a lot of research then in German. I've taught German. I've also taught some English in Spain, but now since 2016 I've been running this program where what we're trying to find out about is how languages connect with creativity. And we're looking at all sorts of different aspects of that. And there are 21 researchers working on the program who are from linguistics, from different languages. There's about 40 languages between us. And there are there's a biologist, someone from anthropology, and from English, and from many different languages that are also then go beyond European languages. And SOAS, for instance, is one of our consortium members, and they teach in a huge range of languages across many different parts of the world. And so this question of how languages and and creativity interact is one that we're researching across the spectrum of what language really consists of, from the cognitive through to text, through performance and language learning.
I'm Tom Crawford. I am a maths tutor at St Hugh's College here in Oxford, and I also am part of the outreach team at St John's College. So I am here to represent maths and science in this debate and to try and give a different perspective on what a language is, and to sort of question how we actually define a language. So I have studied, I did an undergraduate degree in maths here at Oxford. I then did my PhD in applied maths at Cambridge. And as I said, I now teach back in Oxford, so maths is my passion. And when I'm not teaching, I do lots of public engagement and outreach events, trying to get everyone to love maths as much as I do, and also to convince them that maths is a language.
Hello, my name is Mariana Bolognese, and I work with Katherine on the Creative Multilingualism program. I'm Italian, as you can guess from my name, Mariana Bolognese. Actually, I grew up in Italy, even though I was born in the States near Chicago, but from Italian parents. You probably could also hear that I have a strong Italian accent. I hope it's nonetheless clear. And yeah, so I work with Katherine on the Creative Multilingualism program, and my focus is on metaphors, which are, as you may know, the metaphors are can be summarized as something is something else. And as humans, we tend to use metaphors all the time, and that's I think it's a incredible and powerful tool that we have in our communication system, because it breaks all the rules. So with a metaphor we can break the basic logic rule that a table is a table, or you are you, a chair is a chair. With a metaphor we can say that a table is something else, you are something else. So we break the identity rule and we construct new identities.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. So you can send your questions to the experts via email or via social media, or also via the chat. Make sure you also put your school name there as well. So we're going to start off with an introductory question. What is language? Could you all give me your answers?
So if we take that at perhaps the most general level that we tend to think of a language as, so people learn languages at school, that in the UK, that might be, say, French, Spanish, German, or it might be languages that they speak at home, which you can then also do a qualification in. So you might be doing a qualification in Polish or Swahili. So these are languages that are spoken by particular groups, cultural groups, might be nations. And how we define them depends a lot on how these groups define themselves politically. So you very quickly get into all sorts of different complexities. But then you also have the question of what distinguishes one language from another. And in linguistics, sometimes people really just talk about different varieties because the boundaries are very fluid. So is what people talk in Scotland, is that a different language from what people talk in Cornwall, or is it a different dialect of the same language? People can get into quite deep water discussing these questions. And in a country like, or for instance, Nigeria has 600 different languages, some people say. I was at a very cool conference in Senegal looking at language and development, and in Senegal the main language they speak there is Wolof, which I didn't even know existed before I went there, but they also speak French as a kind of lingua franca that unites them also with people speaking other languages in Africa and in other parts of the world, and they also increasingly speaking English. And then within Senegal there are many, many different languages, and often from one village to the next the language differs, perhaps as a dialect, perhaps as a language. So what is a language becomes a very difficult question to answer.
I'm going to take a complete step back and say that from a very basic scientific point of view, I think a language is a way of communicating information. So it's taking something that you know and you want to pass on to somebody else. And so in that instance, something like a chemical formula, perhaps that you've learnt in chemistry, say the formula for methane, CH4, that is a language. That is a way of passing on a piece of information to somebody else. When they read that statement, they then understand what that means. And similarly in maths, you could have equations which will pass on information. And not only, in maths in particular, they're not only passing on information, it's also done in a very neat and concise manner. So for example, you could have Pythagoras' theorem. So you have a right angle triangle, you have 3 different sides, A and B, which join at a right angle, and then C, which is your diagonal. Pythagoras' theorem will tell you, as hopefully you've learned at school, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's a very neat equation. It's really easy to remember. It's been drilled into my head from back in the day at school. I feel like I'll never forget it. But if you try and explain that same bit of information in a sentence, you're sort of saying, well, you have a triangle, and then if you square the length of the bottom side and you square the length of the side that joins it at a right angle and then add them, then that's equal to the square of the third side. And it just becomes very confusing and quite difficult to convey that information. So I think, the sort of the maths behind it, it's very clear, very concise, and it's universally understood. So the statement a squared plus b squared equals c squared is understood in every country around the world. So for me, a language is a way of just getting across information.
Great. What do you think, Mariana?
Interesting. Well, I agree that a language in principle is a system of symbols that we use to convey meaning, to express something, to convey meaning. I think there is a crucial difference between what are called in linguistics human languages, or natural languages, and other types of languages. And human languages, as Katherine was saying, I think they have more. They are definitely more complex, sophisticated, and rich, because good luck talking with just formulas, you know. With a human language, with a natural language, I think we can convey much more, a richer and deeper nuance of meanings. And definitely, human languages are backed up by human cultures, and that is something that probably doesn't back up math language or other types of languages.
Great, so it's great to have a variety of opinions from all of you. So we're going to start with a few questions now. So Katherine, what is the point of speaking more than one language?
Right. So I suppose it depends on perhaps to some extent where you live. So what became very clear to me when I was in Africa was something I knew theoretically but hadn't really quite experienced in this same way, that people speak different languages for different purposes and with different groups, and if they travel even quite small distances, they need to be able to operate in different linguistic mediums. So in India, for instance, it can be very, you might need 5 languages to be able to operate in daily life, because different people you speak to in different parts of society will be speaking different languages, and people seem to negotiate that really extraordinarily successfully. So if you live there, you need to learn all those languages, because otherwise you simply can't function in a day-to-day context. If we're in the UK, it might seem that we can get by with just one language, but actually, even when we're talking to different types of people, or we might be talking to our dog or our grandmother, we are actually constantly moving between different kinds of language, and so we're adapting how we speak and what we say and the language we use, the vocabulary we use. So in some sense, we're all linguists already and right from birth. If there's a question of learning other languages that we don't speak at all, then that becomes actually a very useful thing to do, because it means that we become more able to adapt, we become more able to learn other languages more quickly. And in order to communicate, for example, in business, it's often said that if somebody wants to sell you something, they will talk to you in your language. So if we're in the UK and people want to sell us stuff, they will talk to us in English. But if we want to sell something to them, then they might not be wanting to respond to us so well if we just say, oh, well, you know, I speak English, and they say, okay, fine, but you sell it to me in the language that I understand, and that's going to persuade me. So sort of emotional language and means of persuasion come into it at that point. So it's a very kind of important skill to have, to be able to respond to other people in their language. And I think it's an absolutely essential skill, really, that we should all be wanting to learn. And it's also fascinating to learn about, because we understand more about how communication works in more general terms.
Yeah, that's great. I think I agree on the terms of understanding sort of different dialects between different people, and you speak to people in different ways using different language, really. So I have a question for you, Tom. Is there a universal language in maths or science?
There absolutely is, and I would say I think it's a universal language of the whole universe is maths. Because if you sort of, again, I think my argument here is sort of taking a step back from just Earth and thinking about the whole universe. And you can, for example, think about the the scientific theories that we have to understand the world around us. Sort of the key ones, you have, say, Newton's law of gravity, sort of one of the most fundamental pieces of physics that you will learn about at school. You know, the fact that our Earth orbits the sun because of gravity, this force, the fact that we stay on the surface of the Earth and don't float off because of gravity. But that whole theory is expressed in a very simple and concise mathematical equation that says that force equals some constant times mass 1 times mass 2 divided by the distance squared, where the mass 1 and mass 2 are the mass of the two objects, and the distance squared on the bottom is the distance between those two objects squared. So it's a very nice, simple, concise equation that communicates our whole understanding of the universe. So from that equation, you get that the Earth goes around the sun in an ellipse. You get that we stay on the surface of the Earth, but when you're in space, in the space station, you float. That all comes from that simple equation. And so that is sort of, you know, writing things in maths is a way of expressing these universal concepts in a language, in a scientific language. And then you can also think about it in terms of more modern sort of technology and the way our society today relies so much on computers and technology and our phones and everything else. That sort of coding and programming languages that all of this stuff is written in, it's in the name. It's called a programming language. You know, when you're writing code, you can learn Python, C++, JavaScript. There's all different coding things you can learn, and they are actually called programming languages because each one is conveying information using maths, using numbers, using symbols, using operators. But that is a language sort of there. So I think ultimately I would say maths is the language of science and the language of the universe, in my opinion. And, you know, and then from that you sort of get equations, you get programming languages, you get chemical formulas, but they all stem from sort of maths at the core.
Great. It's lovely to have a different perspective on what we normally consider languages. Don't forget to send all of your questions to us. So, Mariana, are people who can speak more than one language smarter?
That's a very tricky question, and it depends on how you define smartness. Like, what does it mean being smart, you know? And I don't want to go there. But in general, I would say we can talk about whether there are cognitive or whether there are benefits in terms of abilities and skills and so on related to bilingualism and multilingualism. And then there are several studies, for example, showing that on a very basic level, neuroscientists who look at how the brains look like, they take pictures of brains. They showed and demonstrated that bilingualism can bring an increase in the gray and white matter on your brain. So the stuff that surrounds your brain, your cortex, increases, has more volume if you learn a foreign language. Another example would be there are studies showing that that bilinguals have more control in the attention system, because of course if you ask me what's the name of this object, a monolingual would simply say chair. But a bilingual like me, I would have in my mind both words, the word chair as well as the word sedia, which is the Italian equivalent. And so my attention has to be active and well trained in order to suppress the word sedia and prevent that Italian to come out and let the English word come out. So my attention system as a bilingual is more trained than the attention system of a monolingual. So that's also a benefit. There are other benefits that come up in older age. There are studies showing that bilinguals are on average diagnosed with dementia 5 years later than monolinguals. So because your brain is better trained. And there are also other benefits, social benefits, the ability to speak with people you wouldn't be able to speak with if you didn't speak the language. And then there is a strong correlation between bilingualism or multilingualism and creativity. So a monolingual has, imagine Lego, the Lego bricks, okay? Imagine you have 100 bricks. You can come up only with a certain number of new combinations. You can build a certain number of things. A bilingual has double the size of bricks, has 200 bricks. You have more material to draw from, so you can build and combine bricks in more ways, and you're more likely to come up with creative inventions better than a monolingual.
That's great, thank you so much. So now it's time for questions from the audience. So I have one here. C Junior on Instagram asks, wouldn't speaking the same language destroy diversity or whole cultures? Would we forget who we are?
Oh.
What does anyone think?
Can I chime in and say we already do all speak the same language, and it's maths? But I guess this is more of a human language question.
Well, listening to you, I think my problem is that actually I don't speak maths very well at all. And also I grew up in Germany and I did maths in Germany. And so even the words that you're using for particular conventions, to me, don't mean anything immediately at all. So I would say that actually maths is a language like any other that you have to learn, and once you've learnt it, then you can use it with other people who know that language. So yeah, I think it's quite a complicated question. What would you say, Mariana?
Well, we just had last weekend a conference about multilingual identities at the University of Reading, organized by our program, Creative Multilingualism. And there we had examples of people with a multilingual identity. People speaking different languages, they have a multilingual identity. I'm thinking about my son. He's 3 years old, and he's trilingual because I'm Italian and I talk to him in Italian. My husband is American and speaks with my child in English. And then we spent 2 years in the Netherlands because I was working at the University of Amsterdam, and he was going at the daycare and speaking Dutch all day. And at some point he thought he got it, and he thought that all women spoke Italian like mom, all men spoke English like dad, and all the kids spoke Dutch. But yeah, I think his identity is multilingual, and so there are different types of identities, and there is a richer variety, of course, if multilingualism and bilingualism is preserved.
Great, thank you. So, Surbiton High School asks, can we really say that maths is a language when it doesn't carry meaning as other languages do? You can't write a letter in a mathematical and scientific formulae.
Well, I would, as I was sort of tried to explain in my example with Pythagoras' theorem, there's so much information carried there, and that does contain letters. It contains A, B, and C, so in some sense it does contain letters, it does convey information. I guess, having heard both of your sort of opinions on language, it's the issue I guess you're facing when I'm facing when I'm trying to say that maths is a language is that it doesn't have that cultural identity, or as Mariana's just saying, that sort of multilingual identity that comes from being parts of different cultures. Like, you don't really get that with maths. But then I think it all comes down to how you define what a language is. It all sort of comes back to that first question that we all tackled at the beginning. And, from my scientific point of view, the purpose of having a language is to communicate information. And I think maths is the most succinct and concise way of doing that. And also in response to your point about having learnt different words and conventions doing maths in Germany, completely agree. And I've happened to teach maths in Asia, and again it's very different. But I think that when the formula is written down on the page, it's then much clearer because the symbols are the same. So I would imagine you would have had a plus sign. If the number was squared, it was, say it was x squared, it would be x with a little 2 above it. So there is the same written symbols, the same sort of basis there. which perhaps it's a bit different when speaking, I agree, but I think maths works as a written language. Maybe I'll retract my original statement. It's a universal written language.
That's great, thank you. So Izzy and Grace via email ask, how would we decide what language and how would it affect the political state of the world? What do you think, Mariana?
What language shall we learn? What language
Yes.
shall we speak?
Yeah, I'm assuming so. So how would we decide what language to speak if we were just to speak one? And how would it affect the political state of the world?
We shouldn't just speak one. That's the whole point. It would, I think, as human beings, overall, we would be less creative if we all spoke the same language. It would probably be more efficient in business transactions and so on, maybe. But we would be less creative because we would have less variety, and variety is key to to combine things in different way and come up with innovative solutions, progress, innovation. It all comes from creativity, which comes from variability. So
I think there's also another aspect that actually, it's a very important question because the question then of power and what we've been seeing over the last, probably as far back as we can go, is that, for instance, I guess fundamentally it's a question of lingua francas, which extend across groups and might extend across the whole world. And at the moment, English is the lingua franca that is accepted by most people as useful. But actually, there's then the question of what English, and people are now talking about Englishes. There are whole dictionaries of Englishes. So Oxford University Press produces Dictionary of Englishes. Because in different parts of the world people are then making it their own and adapting it and changing it. And recently there's also been a lot of discussion about China becoming much more powerful. Now, if we assume that we're very comfortable actually here in the UK, we all speak English and that's all the only language we need because actually everybody speaks English, and in future probably all those other pesky languages will disappear because everybody will be converging on this one. But actually, if China then becomes more powerful and suddenly actually the UK sort of shrivels and becomes rather small and insignificant, and perhaps America becomes less powerful, so the US is no longer quite able to compete with China, then we're going to be absolutely stuffed because we will only have learned, not only will we only know English, we will not have the capability of adapting to people speaking in other ways. And if you look at the whole natural world, it's very much to do with those creatures that are most adaptable come out, they survive, and the others fall away. So we might end up not able to adapt anymore. And I think learning languages is very much about being adaptable and learning to become increasingly adaptable.
I agree as well. So we have a question from Alka, who asks, how important is non-verbal language in social interaction?
I hope she's not suggesting that I was using my hands too much.
I've been doing it as well.
That's my non-verbal language, my very Italian non-verbal language. I think it's crucial. Non-verbal language, body language, facial expressions, even interpersonal space is crucial. And again, it's very much influenced by your home culture. And so even if we speak the same language, but we use our bodies or our gestures in different ways, then this can very much affect the meaning that we want to convey with the words. So it's crucial.
There's also another dimension, which is, increasingly sign language has become accepted as one of the languages that we really need to be able to speak or to use or to be able to use to communicate. So even the question of, do we speak a language, is that perhaps problematic to say that? Because there's all sorts of different ways of using languages. So at the same conference that Mariana was talking about, we had a performer who was partly telling us about different types of sign language that people speak and people use in different parts of the UK. There are different sign languages in different parts of the world. And there you can see that it's partly, it may be languages that are different because they use a different grammar. It might be the same grammar as the country in which there is also a spoken language that is an equivalent, or it might have its own grammar. But also it's very much using gesture and facial expression as quite a standardized mode of expression. So a gesture or a facial expression becomes a word, and there you can see that actually you can communicate wholly through that means. And I think that it's a question of sort of the multimodality of languages that we've already touched on, that it might be visual to some extent, in a way it's mental, it can be vocal, it can be gesture. We've got all these hugely varied means of communicating. And animals do as well. I mean, if you think about facial expression, that can have a whole text embodied in it.
Can I add a very brief thing?
Yeah.
I think that different modalities of communication or of expression might be more effective at conveying some aspects than others. Like some things are better expressed by words, some things are better expressed by formulas, some things are better expressed by gestures, so.
Yeah, I think language sort of encompasses all of them really, and I think that's sort of the best mode, rather than just speaking one spoken language. I think all of them included works very well. Okay, Tom, I think I'm going to direct this question at you. So, St. George's asked via Twitter, is language how we communicate our ideas, or does the language we speak influence or even determine our thoughts? Ooh. So it's just about communication.
Yeah. Well, in terms of maths, the ideas are the same. They are universal ideas. So going back to the example I gave about Isaac Newton and his law of gravity, that is the same in every country around the world. So there is no opportunity for culture or the spoken language to influence how you interpret that equation. That's what it means. We can test it experimentally. It's a physical law. And then not only on Earth, but also across the universe. So sort of opening up the can of worms of aliens and communication with other civilizations. If we wanted to communicate, if we had a way of communicating with aliens, with a different civilization, what would be the best way of communicating with them? Would it be to send some of our music? Would it be to send a piece of poetry? But then what language do you write the poetry in? And and if you're doing music, does it contain words? What culture does the music come from? Whereas something like maths, something like the universal law of gravity that holds everywhere in the universe, is possibly the best way of communication, because it is that fundamental idea that cannot be influenced from anything else. It's gravity is there, it's a force, it exists, it has no way of being modified by culture, by language, by anything.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for your ideas and opinions. Now it is time to vote. So in order to vote, you need to go to oxplore.org/live-stream-vote and follow the instructions in order to cast your vote. We'll then tally all of those up and announce the results tomorrow afternoon on all of the social media platforms. So while you're giving us your opinion, it's time for the panel here to tell me what they think about, would it be better if we all spoke the same language?
Do you want to go first?
No.
No?
Yeah, you go first.
Of course
You
not.
go first.
I was replying to the question.
Marianne, would you like to?
Yeah, my answer would be no, definitely. It wouldn't be better because, as I said, I think we would be, on average, less creative. We would be less innovative. Like a recent study published by the European Union suggested that knowing a foreign language can increase your wages by between 15 and 20%, something like that. So why giving that away? You know, there are too many pros, too many positive benefits of keeping this variability and actually learning foreign languages.
What do you think, Tom?
I'm going to say that I think the question is immaterial, because ultimately, in my opinion, we ultimately already do speak the same language, and that is the one of maths. Sort of, again, if you think about the most fundamental way of communication, the most fundamental building blocks of Earth, of the universe, they're all communicated via equations, via maths. And so, in my opinion, we already do have that. And then sort of the human languages and the spoken languages that we've been talking about, they're sort of added on top of that as extra layers. But I think sort of the absolute foundation of the way to communicate is through maths and science. So I think we already do speak the same language.
So I think you've just, in a way, proved that by speaking in English about maths, which some of which I understand, most of which I don't, that we need languages for different purposes, that it makes a lot of sense to have languages for different purposes. Animals seem to do that. I think it's actually inconceivable that we would all speak the same language, because really what you get then is kind of a whole bunch of robots that always speak exactly the same language that never changes. I don't think I would want to live in a world of robots. And that one thing that's intrigued me is that, for instance, in the UK, in Wales, people in Wales had their universal language on a plate, in a sense. They'd speak English. You don't really need to go beyond the UK if you don't really want to stay with that. So you could speak English and you could never go beyond English. But actually there was then a movement to create schools where the first language would be Welsh. Completely impractical, but actually very successful, and I think a great initiative. And one of the reasons was because otherwise you completely lose touch with your heritage. And I think that's a hugely important reason why people want to learn languages, is to be back in touch with their heritage. And I think in the UK a lot of children want to learn languages because they want to find out about what they want to be able to communicate with their grandmother. Also in Oxford, for instance, we have some schools have 60, 70 different languages, and it would be terrible to lose those, because actually each one of those is tremendously valuable in getting back in touch, sort of keeping in touch with your family, with your ancestors, and also looking forward with many countries where those languages are then spoken, and open up our world to those countries. So I think that's a hugely valuable and a huge kind of richness that we have.
I agree with you as well. I think languages are very, very important. I think they're key in culture, and discovering other people's culture is something that we love to do. We love to travel, we love to go on holiday, and as well as that, also you were speaking about heritage. I think that as well is very important in order to understand sort of where you come from. And there are certain things that can be only expressed in some languages. So as a student studying Spanish and also knowing English, there are some things that we just don't have words for in English, but you do in Spanish. So I think languages, in that sense, they're very important to keep. And that variation between different languages is very vital, I think. So it's almost time for us to go, but you can keep on entering the prize draw until tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. We'll get in touch with the winners, and we'll also give the results from the vote on all of the social media platforms tomorrow afternoon. If you've enjoyed this, find more questions like this at oxplore.org and register for updates and more features, or follow us on all of the social media platforms. Thank you to the panel for all of your opinions, and thank you to you for your questions and for taking part. Our next live stream event will be on Facebook Live on Friday 16th of March, and we'll hope to see some of you again. Thank you.